declaring you're attractive does not make it so, but that is why it's not analogous to your gender.
Jim Bob, again for $5, says, Grayson, can a biological female be a trans woman? If not, why not?
Can a biological female be a trans woman?
Correct.
No.
Why not?
Because they're biologically female, so they're a cis woman.
How do you know that their brain signature wouldn't show up as being trans?
Could ask them if what if they are a woman or a man. Like usually, people are not going to lie to you about that stuff.
But why would they be lying? They firmly believe they are trans.
Then their brain would be generating that identity.
Okay, so then a biological woman could be a trans woman.
I don't understand what you mean by that, because like the identity is just woman or man. It's not your identity that you're generating is not trans woman. It's
now that's very non-intersectional of you. I disagree completely. Right? The identity politics people would say you're absolutely incorrect. There is an identity to being a biological male and thinking you're a woman, but there's also an identity to being trans. That is a specific socially created identity. And if let's say that it matters because we say we have trans only spaces. So let's say I create a club that's for trans people only. And someone's biologically a woman and says, but I'm trans, I'm a trans woman. Why shouldn't they, and their brain shows up as such? Yes, they do think they're trans women.
It doesn't make sense, man, because they would have been born as the same sex as the gender they identify as.
But it doesn't matter.
They're definitionally not trans.
Trans is a social construct, correct?
Sure, but that doesn't mean that it's just completely arbitrary. Social contracts are not just totally arbitrary.
Okay, right, they're not. But if your brain activity would show that they are showing the same activity as biological men that are trans women, then why wouldn't we say that they're trans women?
Because the biological men that are trans women are having a gender identity of a woman, which would, if this female had that same gender identity in their brain, they would by definition be a cis woman, not a trans woman.
That's not true. Not if we could picture. True. What if we could picture, right? Because you already said that there's a separation between gender and sex in your brain, right?
Yep.
So let's say we see a unique pattern that shows up somewhere in the intermingling of that. And that you're looking at that brain, and that unique pattern, you say, I don't even know how this shit works, but you're like, we see these spots here on this activity, and this signifies a trans person, right? And that also shows up with biological female that are trans men. See, those same spots. Both of them are having the same spots that are trans. One's biological male transitioning to female, the other's biological female transitioning to male, but they both have these identical things that show up that show that they're trans. Why couldn't someone who's biologically male have those same brain signifiers that identifies as a trans man, or someone who's biologically female is that identifies as a trans woman? Because it's all
because that's not like the biology does not work that way. Like
you don't know that.
The identifiers are like the neural circuitry of your gender in your brain is going to be more similar to a woman. It's not like there's categories of woman and trans woman. It's just woman. Like there's a certain.
But you don't know that. You're talking out your ass right now. You don't know that.
I can tell you the study if you would.
But you don't. But I'll bet that study. You don't know that science won't eventually advance there. You don't know. That study wasn't.
All science is predicated on like new data could come out and change it. Like the shape of the earth, the age of the universe, every single scientific fact is, is subject to change based on new data.
Right. But the point I'm trying to make then it's theoretically possible for a woman to be a trans woman.
I don't know how.
Their brain signatures show that that's how they truly feel.
So you're saying, okay. So you're saying that they're born like XX.
Let's say I have, okay,
female.
Here.
Wait, they're born a female.
I can do this easier.
Their brain structure has the gender of a woman, but their actual brain chemistry, in the sex correspondent circuits, is more male.
Right. Let me do this easier for you.
There would need to be a biological explanation for why.
Take a break and let me make this easier for me. I have dissociative personality disorder. So I have 6 personalities within me. Right? I'm a biological man. One of those personalities is me. The other is Sarah, who's a biological woman.
Okay.
One of them is Jim, who's a trans man.
Okay.
My brain activity with that dissociative disorder could theoretically show that it's identifying patterns of someone who thinks they're a trans man. Why couldn't that be possible?
I mean, you can definitely think that you're a trans man because you've constructed a false life history because you have multiple personality disorders, and maybe you're a 9-year-old girl in one of them, and you're a trans man in another. I mean, sure, you can have that in multiple personality disorders.
Okay, so then the question becomes, if the brain signature shows that, then isn't that who I am?
No, because the brain signature would just have the gender that you're identifying as. It wouldn't have like
you don't
the
know
actual
that.
gender identity of that person is just
you don't know that. You're talking out your ass. You don't know that. You don't know that at all.
What do you mean you don't know that?
Because let's assume if that could change, right? Like if we could see identifiers that speak to identifying as trans. Like hypothetically, let's say this. Let's uncomplicate this. Let's say like the idea of attractive. Let's say that we could look at a brain signature and determine if people think self-identify as being attractive or not, right? And we could hypothetically say, oh, people that say they're attractive, they have these brains. You could agree that someone who's objectively not attractive could still have the
What is objectively not attractive?
Oh, their fucking face is mangled and scarred.
I don't think attraction corresponds with any objective. It's a subjective thing.
Nonetheless, fine. It's totally subjective, fine. That makes my argument even better. So it's totally subjective, but there could still be brain signatures, hypothetically, that you would be able to point to by just looking at brain chemistry and scans. That person thinks they're attractive. That person doesn't, right? Why couldn't you have the same, that person thinks they're trans?
Because attraction is, like, being attractive is not a self-identity, but being a woman or a man is.
Why isn't saying that you're attractive a self-identity? I mean,
because declaring you're attractive does not make it so, but that is why it's not analogous to your gender.
So just to be clear, self-subjectively saying you're attractive, even if a chemical scan, which you've already admitted, can say that your brain's showing up as someone who thinks they're attractive, that doesn't make it so, even though your brain says it.
And it's not a contradiction, and I'll be happy to explain why it's not a contradiction. Because there are certain categories that depend on self-ID. There are other categories that do not. You are trying to conflate them and say all categories are the same, but that is not the case. Some categories, the only sufficient criteria for whether or not you fall into that category is your own self-ID. That is the fact. We already went over it.
That's not true. That you're differentiating stuff that has
being a Gorillaz fan is such a category.
No, you're differentiating something that has no warrant to differentiate it. For example, you just said that attractive is completely subjective. So then the only criteria, just to be clear, self-subjectively saying you're attractive, even if a chemical scan, which you've already admitted, can say that your brain's showing up as someone who thinks they're attractive, that doesn't make it so, even though your brain says it.
And it's not a contradiction, and I'll be happy to explain why it's not a contradiction. Because there are certain categories that depend on self-ID. There are other categories that do not. You are trying to conflate them and say all categories are the same, but that is not the case. Some categories, the only sufficient criteria for whether or not you fall into that category is your own self-ID. That is the fact. We already went over it.
That's not true. That you're differentiating stuff that has
being a Gorillaz fan is such a category.
No, you're differentiating something that has no warrant to differentiate it. For example, you just said that attractive is completely subjective. So then the only criteria for being attractive is self-identifying.
That is not logically following. Just because something is subjective does not mean that the only logical criteria should be self-ID. That is not logically track. For example, the fact that somebody's is attractive is subjective to other people. It's not a subjective in your own self-ID. Other people have to find you attractive for you to fit into the category of attractive.
Just like woman.
Subjective, but it's subjective for
just like woman.
The person in question.
You're almost there. Just like woman. That's right. You can say you're a woman, but if the rest of society says, no, you're not, then you're not. That's right.
I do not think that you can draw this analogy because gender does have self-ID as a primary component, whereas what you're trying to analogize does not. This is why it's not analogous.
You're drawing differentiations that won't matter. If the brain scan shows someone who thinks they're attractive, and you could just look at the brain scan, which you've already admitted that's the case, then there's no reason that you can't say that somehow doesn't apply, because it still requires other people saying that you have to be attractive.
I can't exactly say that.
You can say it, but it's a distinction without merit. It is the exact same argument that one would use on gender. And you have no reason that it would differentiate. None.
And I'll offer the reason right now, and you can keep going. But again, I've explained this to you. You were trying to say all categories are the same. That is objectively not true. Some categories are entirely dependent on self-ID, such as if you're a fan of something. Everybody agrees with this. You agree with it too, even if you won't say so out loud. There are some categories that only depend on self-ID. We should all be able to agree with this. So your arguments do not apply to.
But even if that's true, how the hell is woman not one of those?
I'm saying that gender is one of those. You're saying it's not.
Correct.
That is our disagreement.
Correct.
But in principle, you should agree that your arguments do not apply to self-ID categories.
Right. What I'm saying is that there are things when it comes to descriptive terms and things like saying I enjoy something is different than saying I am something, right? And so when you're saying I'm a Gorillaz fan, you're saying I enjoy Gorillaz. That's different than a self-identity, right? When a self-identity is saying I am attractive, it's not saying I enjoy attractive people, it's saying I am attractive. That's analogous to saying I am a woman, right? And if the brain scan shows that you think you're attractive, then you would have no right to say that person's not attractive, because there are outside metrics. And if you're right about that, you're right, which is exactly which is exactly the truth with the category of women. You can have final say on it, and then I got to move on. I can't be here all fucking night litigating the debate. The
first thing that you said is wrong, because you literally do not even have to enjoy something to be a fan of it. I could be a Gorillaz fan and hate Gorillaz music, and I just like the aesthetic. You don't. Like, you cannot.
So you enjoy the aesthetic. It's something that you enjoy.
You cannot gatekeep somebody's identity. If somebody says that they're a fan of the music, you can't objectively test that. You just have to take them at their word of their self-ID. That's how the category works.
But again, how would you objectively test someone that says they're a woman?
You don't.
You already said you can.
Yeah, not with today's technology.
But their brain. So then why couldn't we do the same with attractive, which you already admitted would have similar brain scans? Why are these two things not analogous?
The thing is, you would have to brain scan everyone else to see if they're attracted to that person.
No, that's not true at all.
That is true.
So then you would have to brain scan everyone else to see if they think that person's a woman.
No, because look, if you were to identify someone as tall, you could not do that unless you compared them to others. This is the same category as attractive, because that is a category that is dependent on those around you.
Just like woman.
This category is
just like woman. Absolutely just like woman. You can't declare you're a woman. It is dependent. It is analogous. You can't say I'm a woman.
We're not going to agree on this. I think it's self-ID. You don't.
Last question I have on this. If someone that everyone thinks is unattractive has a brain scan that they think they're attractive, are they attractive or not?
No.
Okay. Same with woman. All right.
Not same.
Yes.
Different categories.
It is not a different category.
Apples to oranges, not analogous.
You can't give any differentiation to why it's a different category.
I just did, dude. I've been giving it to you all
You're just saying,
long.
Go ahead. Break it down one more time for us.
One category is sufficiently described by self-identification. The other self-identification does not factor
Why? How do you determine that this is sufficiently identified by self-identification?
Because it is a result of your gender identity in your brain that is being generated in your brain.
So because of chemical processes in your brain.
Yeah.
Okay. Why wouldn't it be the same with those chemical processes when in terms of attractive?
Because being attractive is not a self-ID category.
Why not? Yes, it is.
I mean, okay, I guess you can ID as attractive, but whether or not you are in the category of attractive has nothing to do with your identification. There are highly attractive people that do not identify as attractive, and they're still in that category. Why? Because your personal identification is not even a criteria at all about whether or not you're attractive.
Same's true of woman.
It is not the same.
The only reason you're saying it's different.
Demonstrate it scientifically.
No, you can't.
Yes, we
Both
can.
we have brain chemical activity in both hands that are analogous. You're just saying, well, with one as society, we have determined even if you think you're attractive, we all have to agree you're attractive for you to really be attractive. But that's different with women. I say, why? You're like, well, because of brain activity. I say, but we can see that brain activity with attractiveness. And you're like, yeah, but that doesn't work because we all have to agree that that person's attractive. I say, right, same with women. You go, no. I say, well, why is it different? You say, well, because there's brain activity. And I say, right, just like with attractiveness. And you say, yeah, but that doesn't work with attractiveness because we all have to agree. I say, yes, just like women. You say, no. It's just repetitive. You're not giving a reason to differentiate
the fundamental difference is that I'm saying that gender, the sufficient criteria is self-ID. You say, no, gender is similar to attraction, where it is a category bestowed upon you by others, rather than a category dependent on your own self-ID.
That's not true. In the same way that you could self-identify as a woman, you could self-identify as attractive.
Rob, are you saying that's not true, as in that's not our disagreement?
I'm saying, no, I'm saying that what you're saying is untrue. That you could
But that is our disagreement, right? You agree that that's what we disagree.
I think the disagreement is you've just made an arbitrary distinction that you should be able to self-identify as a woman, and that when we have other categories that have similar brain activity that you would be able to see, you say, no, those don't count for some reason.
So here's why I've made that distinction, right? Because when you look at what is biologically happening in the brain, you can see that there are two meaningfully different phenomenon that are occurring. It is useful to have a term that differentiates these two phenomenon. You're saying we should not differentiate these terms, or you're saying, like, I'm differentiating gender and sex. These are meaningfully, biologically distinct phenomena that are worth differentiating with our language, just like mammals and fish are two terms worth differentiating. I'm just saying there's two phenomena happening here biologically. We should have two words to describe them.
Well, it's not woman. Okay, next super chat.